B7D. And what is today? The 8th. This is period 7, unit 7, and it's evolution 2. Okay, so when we look at this, B7D says that you're going to analyze and evaluate how the elements of natural selection and I'm going to edit this a little bit. I don't usually, but I'm going to because I want you to really focus on what it's telling you to do. I'm going to put in parentheses including, and it lists 4 parts of this, but I don't want to list that right here. I want you to realize that you need to analyze and evaluate how the elements of natural selection result in differential reproductive success. Sometimes when they write these teaks, you kind of can get lost in what it is they're trying to get you to understand or know. And so this made sense to me if I kind of deleted a little bit of that stuff. We're going to talk about each of the things, the parts of the natural selection theory, but I want you to really focus on what it says. Analyze and evaluate how elements of natural selection result in differential reproductive success. So the first thing we need to talk about is, what does it mean by this differential reproductive success? So let's go right down here. Differential reproductive success. Okay, think about having a large population of organisms, and they're all in the same species. They're all in the same general area too. I mean, technically you could say they're in the same big community. Think about, you've seen those discovery videos where it's got out on the savanna grasslands where you've got, a herd of 1,000 wildebeests. Well, you're not going to have all those wildebeest making one cohesive unit. You have family pods within there, right? Does that make sense? Because you can't have one male that's going to reproduce with all those hundreds and hundreds of females. That doesn't even make sense, does it? So you're going to have like little family groups within that. And they're going to be territorial within that group. So you have maybe a pod over here of maybe 25 organisms. And then over here you've got another 25 or 30. And then over here maybe you've got 15. So within that one big population, that one big species, you have groups within that. Think of them kind of like family groups, okay? And they're not all equally successful. That's what we mean by differential reproductive success. And when I say they're not all equally successful, it's all about reproducing and passing those genes on to the next generation. So differential reproductive success, which groups of organisms in a species, which groups of organisms in a species, you should be able to define that word species by now, have more offspring. And when I say have more offspring, I mean they have more offspring that actually survive to grow up and become adults and reproduce. Okay, so I'm going to put a box around this word group right up here, the groups, because it's going to be more specific about what we're talking about. These are groups with different variations. Groups with different variations. And remember, we're talking about all these organisms in one species. They're all the same species. But within that, you have groups. Kind of like in Borger, all the humans are the same species, but don't we have family units? We have units, we have family units in different areas. So, that's kind of like what we're talking about. So we have groups within there with different variations. And those family groups, don't they have some distinctive variations? You can tell they're family, usually. They have some similar characteristics, variations. And when I say variations, I'm going to throw another phrase at you. and we'll hit it again later on. By variations, I mean gene frequencies. I briefly mentioned that earlier, gene frequencies. So there are genes, traits, that pop up over and over and over again in those little family units. So differential reproductive success means which of the groups within a species have more offspring that survive and reproduce, pass those genes on. If they survive, the offspring survive and reproduce themselves, that's considered reproductive success. And there are going to be some that are better able than others, and those are the ones that are evolutionarily successful. So what you're doing here in this teak is you're going to say, okay, how does natural selection result in having better successful reproductive groups? Okay, so there are 4 parts that we talked about with natural selection. So I'm going to start off here with natural selection. Boy, that pink is bright. Okay, so we have natural selection. And again, we've talked about this. These things shouldn't be too shocking to you guys. They should be at least a little bit familiar to you guys. So in the first step of natural selection, we have overpopulation. And it's a very specific type of overpopulation that I'm talking about. More specifically, they are overproducing the offspring. So how does overproducing offspring result in differential reproductive success? Okay, the more offspring you produce, the greater chance you have of some of them surviving. Okay, so the vast majority of organisms on our planet follow this massive, a lot of babies, a lot of offspring. Plants, how many seeds does a dandelion plant put out? Think about that one little puffball of dandelion, how many seeds are on there? Estimate. Have you ever blown one? You've blown the dandelion puff? Aren't there 50 to 100 seeds that come off one of those, and that one plant produces lots of those, right? They produce a ton of seeds, lots and lots and lots of offspring, in the hopes that maybe a handful will survive. That's what it means by that. So the more offspring you produce, the greater chance you have of them surviving. Now, that's the majority of organisms on the planet. There are 2 ways that actually happens. That's called that's K-selective and R-selective. There's a K-selective where they produce tons of organisms, babies. And there's R-selected, and there are a lot of organisms that follow this where they produce a few babies and then they take care of them really well. So the ones that produce tons and tons and tons of babies, offspring, they pretty much put all the energy into making the eggs, and then once they crack open or once they form the seeds, they just let it go. Nobody takes care of them, they're just on their own. Hopefully a few of them survive and pass those genes on. The opposite side of that is that R-selected, where what they do is they say, okay, we're going to put all our energy things on the planet, though, this is what most of the organisms do. They go through this process of overpopulation. So there are some other ways of evolving where you have fewer organisms and you take care of them, but still, this is the one that's evolutionarily, it's the most successful when you talk about the numbers of organisms that do it this way. Okay, number two, besides overpopulation, the next step is there are lots of variations. Variations. Remember, variations are just differences, right? Oh, gotta move it up some. There we go, variations. Okay, so there are three major ways that variations can occur in a population. So three ways they can occur. First of all, you have mutations. And mutations are permanent changes in a cell's DNA, which I'm pretty sure you guys are familiar with. Permanent changes in a cell's DNA. And these changes are passed on to the offspring. So they can be positive changes, which means they increase the reproductive success. They can be negative changes, which means they decrease the reproductive success, or they can have no impact at all on reproductive success. So if they're positive, they increase reproductive success. If they're negative, well, they're going to decrease it, and ultimately that mutation is going to be kicked out of the gene pool, right? It was never passed on to any offspring. It was so bad. The next type of creating variations or getting variations in an offspring is through genetic recombination. This is through sexual reproduction. And we'll talk about this later on when we talk about DNA and how DNA reproduces, mitosis and meiosis and stuff. So genetic recombination is when you have a new combination of genes. Can I put combo for combination? You guys know that? Yeah. Okay, I'm going to present two phrases to you, and I'm just going to talk about them. You're not going to take a lot of notes about them, but just realize that these are going to come up later on, and you're going to have to kind of deal with this. So it's a new combination of genes due to crossing over. There's the first one. And independent assortment. Do any of you guys know how many chromosomes you have in each cell? Anybody? I got some crazy numbers earlier on the day when I asked that. Yeah? 46. Okay, so we have 46 chromosomes in all of our cells. So we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. You got one chromosome from your mom, okay, so they number them. They're like chromosomes, so we have 2 of the number 1 chromosomes, 2 of the number 2s, 2 number 3s, all the way up to the number 22. And then your last pair is actually the X or the Y chromosome. So you have an XX, you're a female. If you have an XY, you're a male. Yes, you've heard of that before. So we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Of each of those pairs, you got one of those chromosomes from your mom, one from your dad. So of the number 1s, you got one from each parent. Of the number 2s, you got one from each parent, and so on and so on, right? Okay, so when your parents were creating sex cells in the body, like the sperm and the egg, when they got those, they basically, okay, so let me track this around. How many, if you've got 46 chromosomes in each of your cells, how many chromosomes are in the sex cells, the sperm and the egg? 23, yes? You get half from your mom, half from your dad, yes? The sperm fertilizes the egg, so you've got the full set of 46, yeah? Well, the cool thing is, when the sperm cells are made, you've got 46 chromosomes to choose from, but you have to make sure you get one of the number 1s, one of the number 2s, one of the number 3s, and so on, right? Okay, so it doesn't matter which of those number 1s you get, as long as one gets put into each of the new sperm cells that are made, right? Because you're going to take this cell, it's going to split into the sperm cells, let's say it splits into 2. Then you have the number 2 chromosomes, and it could be that you got the left one in here and the right one in here, or maybe it's swapped. Yeah? And then the third one, it doesn't matter which one as long as you have one. So they separate independently from each other. So all those pairs of chromosomes chromosomes, if you lined them all, you said here's the left side, here's the right side, we're all lined up. It doesn't matter whether this sperm cell gets all the left ones and this one gets all the right ones. It doesn't work that way. They get them flipped over and flipped around, so it just depends on what you get. As long as you get one of each, it doesn't matter if you got, like if you're talking socks, you don't have to have all the left socks together and all the right socks together. Yeah, they just independently assort. Because of that, you get some genes from your mom and some genes from your dad, yes? Yeah, some of them, of the traits from your mom are dominant, some of them are recessive. It just depends on what's going on here. So independent assortment means that when your body is making sex cells, they don't have to all be perfectly alike. They're not all going to be exactly alike because maybe they got this number one in one sex cell and the other number one in another sex cell, yeah? And then in the same group, you had this number two and this one and this number two and the other, and they just kind of flip. So the ones separate independently from the twos, which separate independently from the three chromosomes, the number three chromosomes, yes? It sounds mangled when I'm saying it. Do you understand what I'm talking about, though? Okay. So the next thing is crossing over. So we get more variation with this independent assortment thing. We also get more variation with this really weird stuff called crossing over. Okay, so it is really important that each of the sex cells has only half of the chromosomes, right? And they have to have the correct number, like they have to have one of the number ones, one of the number twos. If you skip over and you don't have a number three, that's bad. Yeah, most people can't live without a number three chromosome. You don't have there's a standard, you can look online and you can find out what are some genetic, chromosomal diseases. There is no chromosomal disease where you have only one of the number three chromosomes because the baby doesn't survive. Unlike Down syndrome, they have three of the number 21 chromosomes. Yeah, that's fairly common. I mean, you can look up the statistics, but the baby survives that. In most cases, having an extra chromosome, if you have an extra number one chromosome, nobody survives that. There's no disease for that because the baby doesn't survive. So it's kind of rare if you have an extra chromosome to survive. That's something pretty amazing. If you have one less chromosome, that's really another one for the baby to survive. So it's really important that lining them up and getting them ordered so that each sex cell has the full half. Yes? So to make sure that happens, right before the cells are produced, kind of split into two separate sex cells, what they do is all the number one chromosomes stick together. The number two chromosomes stick together. The number three chromosomes stick together. So they have them organized. They put them together so then you can make sure one is in each one. Yeah? Cool thing is, though, when they stick together, they swap pieces. They just do. They align right. They've got the same chromosomes in the same alignment, and they swap pieces. It's called crossing over. It just happens. Little sections of DNA swap. So that when you talk about the number one chromosome, and maybe you got that from your mother, that whole number one chromosome on the left-hand side, maybe you got that from another, it's not going to be exactly like the mother's chromosome because of crossing over. So what you give to your baby is going to be slightly different than what your mother gave to you. That's weird, and that happens. They didn't know that happened for the longest time until they really started looking chemically at the chromosomes, and so they would chemically light up a part of a chromosome, and they would notice that it didn't stay on the chromosome like a little gene. They didn't stay on that chromosome where they stuck it. It got crossed over. It swapped to different places. So it's really, really weird, but that allows for more variation, and variation is the king. It's the thing that rules, because variation enables survival. Okay, so think about this a minute. If all of the humans were exactly the same, if one human got the COVID and died from it, every other human that got COVID would also die from it, right? Variation is the thing that's most important because not all your immune systems are alike. Especially when it comes to disease, that's where variation is hugely important. We don't have to worry too much about running from predators, do we? You know, our big deal, our predators, our biggest problem is always going to be disease from bacteria and viruses, things like that. So for humans, we focus on that. So when we talk about variation, variation is the key that enables us to survive in that sense. Okay, so we have variations. The next one we have, hang on, I'm going to put these two right here. Let's put something more in this. These increase variation, differences. And even though humans are more than 99% identical, that 0.01% where we're not identical, that's where all the variations are. That's what enables makes one human better able to survive than another. That's why some humans get fever blisters and some don't. It's a resistance to a disease. The third piece on natural selection is the struggle, or is the, I'm sorry, I missed one. I totally skipped one. Why do you guys let me do this? Okay, so we have mutations which increase variation. We have genetic recombination that increases variation. And then we also have migration. And I'm talking a little bit of a different migration than what you guys are thinking of. This is not migration from North America to South America. Okay, we're not talking about moving vast amounts of land. What we're talking about is migrating from one population or one group in the same species to another. So you're moving from one breeding group in a population to another. So we have that big, vast, huge herd of wildebeest, and they have their little family pods. Well, if there are too many males in there, one of those males is going to get kicked out, right? And he's going to be isolated, moved over, and he's going to have to get into another family. And when you do that, he's taking his genes from his little family group into another little family group. Just like when you guys marry out of you're not going to marry within your own family, are you? Please no. Yeah, we don't do that whole inbreeding stuff, right? So you're going to marry outside of your family, and what that does is you can think of it as you putting your genes into another family group. So it allows for variation there. So migration, in this case, we're talking about when you have an organism moving from one breeding group in a population to another. And within that community, what it does is it changes the gene pool. There's another phrase there. It changes the gene pool in that group. And overall makes the population much healthier. Okay, gene pool. Gene pool is like, okay, here's all the genes that are there. Here are all the genes for these organisms that we have to choose from. So it alters that gene pool. Variation makes for differences that are there. Now, number 3, the third part in the natural selection, is survival of the fittest. And this survival of the fittest, those with the best variations will survive to reproduce. Not just survive, but they are going to survive so that they can reproduce. And when I say best variations, we don't necessarily look at it and say, oh yeah, that's better than the others. What it is whichever one survives to reproduce, those are going to be the best variations. So those with the best variations will survive to reproduce. Now, can accidents happen so it knocks that out? Well, sure they can. Oh, look, lightning struck, a tree fell. That animal's dead. That's just going to happen. But when we say the fittest, survival of the fittest, what we're talking about is, when we say fittest, it's not how strong they are or how far they can run. It's a measure of their reproductive success. If they are not reproductively successful, then they're not fit. Okay, and then the fourth one, and I could blob the step 3 and 4 together, but I like separating them out. Makes me happy. Those that survive pass their variations on to their offspring. They pass these variations on. That's the kicker. They have to survive and they have to reproduce to pass those traits on. I don't have any kids, so I'm not passing any of my variations on. So whatever variations I had that were successful are not going to be passed on. So I am not fit I am reproductively unsuccessful. So in the evolutionary scheme of things, I'm a branch that failed. I can live with that. Yeah? So if the organism has all these great variations, but they're incapable of passing those traits on, then they're not considered the fittest. Even though they may be stronger, they may be faster, if they can't pass those traits on, then they're not going to be able to conceive to be the fittest. Now, the last thing I'm going to add to this is that if these changes build up over time, that's when you have evolution occurring. B-U-I-L-D. And remember, it's not just a little bit of time, it's a big amount of time, right? If these changes build up over time, that would be plural, then a new species can be produced. Or they can evolve, right? That's how evolution occurs. That's how natural selection is used in that evolutionary process. So it's not, these things happen all the time. You can see this natural selection happening all the time in life. It's just actually that happens. When this happens over vast periods of time, that's when you have evolution occur. This would be the standard for both gradual evolution and also punctuated. Punctuated tends to come into more into play when you talk about mutations that arise. That's when you deal with more of the punctuated evolution. The gradual evolution is more of a slower process than that. Okay, once you've written that down, you can go ahead and stop for a second.